I walked into the living room with my scrubs still clinging to my skin after a 12-hour shift in the ICU, hoping for a moment of quiet before collapsing into bed. But the moment I opened the door, I knew peace was impossible. My stepmother Jillian stood in the middle of the room with her arms crossed and her mouth already twisted into the same angry sneer I had seen since I was a teenager. She glared at the name badge still clipped to my shirt, as if the sight of my job offended her. I asked her to please move aside because I was exhausted and needed to change, but she stepped closer and told me I was nothing but a burden, a parasite who should be grateful she let me live in a house that was never mine. I tried to walk past her while keeping my voice steady, but she slapped me across the face so quickly that my vision blurred. Before I could recover, she slapped me again harder with a sharp sound that echoed through the house. I stumbled backward and tasted blood on my lip, but she did not stop. She accused me of draining her life, of embarrassing her by working long shifts of acting superior because I cared for dying patients. I tried to step away from her reach, but that was when Caleb stormed in from the hallway. My 22-year-old stepbrother reeked of beer and anger, and the look in his eyes told me he had been listening and waiting for a chance to join the attack. He asked his mother what I had done this time, and when she shouted that I refused to hand over money, he lunged at me without hesitation. His fist connected with my back just below my shoulder blade, sending pain shooting through my chest. I fell to my knees, gasping, but he grabbed my arm and shoved me to the floor as if I weighed nothing. Jillian yelled at him to teach me a lesson, and he kicked the side of my ribs before she pushed him away and stepped in as if the fight belonged to her alone. She struck my stomach with the side of her shoe while telling me to get out before she called the police and claimed I attacked her. I curled inward, trying to protect my ribs while wheezing for air, and I realized I was outnumbered and outmatched. I pushed myself off the carpet with shaking hands and crawled away from them while they screamed behind me. I grabbed my bag from the chair near the door and ran outside into the cold Tennessee rain, letting the door slam behind me. The night air stung the fresh swelling on my cheek, and the rainwater mingled with the blood running from my nose. My breathing was fast and shallow, and I felt the same familiar fear pulsing in my ears, the fear that had been part of my life since Jillian had moved in years ago. I reached my car with trembling fingers, opened the door, and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands shook so badly I had to hold the key with both hands to put it in the ignition. The headlights illuminated the driveway where I had played as a child back when my father was alive, and everything still felt safe. My chest tightened as another wave of humiliation rolled over me, and I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and tried to slow my breathing, but the memory of my father came back so suddenly that it knocked the air out of me. I reached into the inner zipper of my purse and pulled out my father's old leather wallet, the one thing I kept with me every day since he passed. Inside was the card he had given me on my 17th birthday, a silver bank card with his initials etched into the corner. He had told me to keep it safe and only use it when I had nowhere left to go. At the time, I laughed and told him I would never need it, but he gave me a look filled with a sorrow I never understood until now. I had always imagined the card held a few $100s at most, maybe a final gesture from a father who had worked himself to the bone to take care of me. But now, as rain pounded on the windshield and pain throbbed through my ribs, I felt something shift inside me. I stared at the card and heard my father's voice in my mind telling me that he trusted me to know when the time was right. Maybe this was that moment. Maybe the reason I had held on to the card for so long was because deep down I knew a night like this would come. My body hurt with every breath and my eyes stung from tears and rain, but a small, fragile thread of hope stirred in my chest. With the engine humming beneath my hands, I backed out of the driveway and drove through the storm toward the old brick bank near the hospital. The roads were slick and streaked with water, and every turn made my bruised body ache, but I did not stop. I refused to turn back this time. I parked in front of the bank, still open under its late evening lights, and forced myself out of the car. My clothes were soaked. My cheek was swollen. My heart was racing. I pushed the glass door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the lobby hit my skin and made me shiver even harder. A teller looked up at me, her eyes widening at the sight of my bruises, and she asked if I needed help. I placed the old silver card on the counter and told her I needed to access the account. She picked it up, confused at first, then nodded and asked me to wait. I stood there, dripping rainwater onto the clean tile floor, unaware that the moment she swiped that card, my entire life would split in two. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough and kept my head down long enough, I could earn a kind of peace inside that house that the storms Jillian brought with her could be survived if I simply stayed quiet and did what was expected of me. I was 15 the first time my father introduced her standing in our driveway in a pale blue dress and an overly sweet smile that made her look harmless. My father seemed happier than he had been in years, and I wanted so badly to support that happiness. He had spent most of my childhood working double shifts at the fire department, coming home exhausted and smelling like smoke, but always pulling me into a hug before he even took off his gear. He loved me with a steady kind of loyalty, and I always believed nothing could shake that. When he told me he was marrying Jillian, I forced myself to smile and tell him I was happy because his eyes had a gentleness that made me want to protect it. But the moment the wedding ended and the guests left, Jillian's sweetness evaporated. I still remember the first morning she raised her voice at me complaining that I left a glass in the sink even though it was my father who had used it, and when I tried to explain, she told me not to talk back to her in her own home. I did not understand it then, but that was her first attempt at rewriting ownership. She wanted control, and the easiest way to get it was to convince me that everything in the house was hers. Within weeks, she began to police what I wore, how late I studied, and how much time I spent with my father. If I lingered too long in his room, she would complain that I was interrupting their bond. If I hugged him, she would roll her eyes. When my father noticed her behavior and confronted her, she would burst into tears and accuse me of resenting her. My father, gentle and tired, tried to smooth things over, tried to parent the way he always had, but Jillian had a way of twisting every conversation into a knot that left him confused and apologetic. She introduced a constant tension into our lives that made me feel like I was walking on thin ice in my own home. And then came Caleb. He was 17 when they moved in, lanky and angry and sarcastic, the kind of teen who believed everyone owed him something. He saw my father's warmth and my quiet nature as weaknesses and learned quickly that his mother's resentment of me could be used to his advantage. If he wanted extra money, he would blame me for moving his belongings, and Jillian would take his side. If something broke, he would say I did it, and she would ask my father to discipline me. My father, tired from back-to-back shifts and reluctant to escalate conflict, tried to believe the best in everyone, including them, but I could see the way his shoulders sagged more each month. By the time I graduated high school, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt like a place where I was tolerated only when I was invisible. When I enrolled in nursing school, my father was proud, but Jillian acted as though I had chosen a path purely to spite her. She resented every hour I spent away from home and told me repeatedly that I was selfish for leaving her to manage the house, even though she barely worked. During those years, I often stayed late on campus studying in quiet corners just to avoid the tension waiting at home. Yet no matter how late I stayed, I always returned because my father was there and he was the anchor that kept me from drifting completely into despair. Then came the diagnosis: Stage 4 lung cancer. He had never smoked a day in his life, but years of breathing toxic fumes on rescue calls had done their damage. The doctor said he had months. Jillian wept loudly in the hospital, clutching his arm as if she were the only one who mattered, but when the nurses left, she scolded him for not telling her sooner, as if he had chosen to get sick. My father spent his final weeks apologizing to both of us, desperate to calm a storm that was never his fault. I tried to stay strong for him, but I cried quietly in the hospital cafeteria during my breaks from nursing school, unable to accept how quickly I was losing the only parent who had ever made me feel safe. The night he died, I held his hand as the machines went silent, and he whispered that he loved me and that everything was taken care of. At the time, I assumed he meant the funeral arrangements, not the life he had quietly prepared for me. Jillian took over immediately. She told me I needed to respect her grief as if mine was smaller, as if I no longer had the right to mourn. She claimed the house was hers, now that my father left everything to her, because she had been his wife. She said it with such certainty that I did not question it, even though the idea that he would disinherit me made no sense. But grief makes the mind foggy, and I was drowning in it. She told me that if I wanted to keep living there, I would need to pay rent because she could not carry the financial burden alone. I was 25, juggling nursing shifts and student loans, and I had no choice but to agree. That was when the real cruelty began. She criticized the food I brought home from the hospital cafeteria, mocked the tired slump of my shoulders, and accused me of trying to embarrass her when I returned late from work. Caleb joined her effortlessly. He would steal my laundry, scream at me over nothing, blame me for his own messes, and when I confronted Jillian, she always sided with him. They created a home where I was treated not as a daughter or even a stepdaughter, but as an unwanted tenant who was allowed to exist only if I contributed and stayed silent. Over time, I learned to shrink myself to tiptoe to anticipate their moods. Every insult chipped away pieces of me until I felt like a shadow of the girl my father raised. When the physical attacks began, they were small at first, a shove here and there, an arm grabbed too tightly, a door slammed inches from my face. I told myself it was stress that they were grieving too. But grief does not last years. Abuse does. I hid the bruises at work because nurses are taught to be strong for everyone else, and I had convinced myself that needing help was a kind of failure. Some nights I returned to my car after a shift with my hands shaking, terrified to drive home. But I went anyway because rent anywhere else was impossible with my loans, and because a part of me still clung to the memory of my father in that house. The cycle repeated year after year. Work, come home, endure, survive, repeat. And in the darkest moments, I remembered something my father had whispered in the hospital the week before he died. He said that if I was ever backed into a corner, I would know what to do. I did not understand his words then, and I did not understand why he pressed his old leather wallet into my hand, telling me to keep it close. I thought it was simply sentiment. I did not know he had foreseen everything, that he had seen the truth of Jillian in ways I was too young to grasp. I did not know that he left the one thing that could save me tucked away behind a faded photograph of us at a county fair. I carried his wallet everywhere, but never touched the silver card because I did not believe the moment he warned me about would ever come. I told myself I was stronger than the pain, braver than the fear, and capable of rebuilding my life without help. But standing in that bank lobby with the rain soaking through my scrubs and bruises blooming across my skin, I finally understood. My father had known that Jillian would try to break me, and he had given me the key to escape long before I realized I needed it. I remember every detail of that day with a kind of sharpness that still tightens my chest when I think about it, because it was the day all the cracks that had formed over the years finally split wide open. I had just finished a 12-hour shift in the ICU, the kind of shift that leaves your bones humming with exhaustion. We had lost a patient during the early morning hours, a man in his 40s whose heart simply could not fight anymore. I performed compressions until my arms trembled, and afterward I stood in the supply closet pretending to reorganize bandages just so no one would see my eyes filling with tears. By the time I walked to my car after clocking out, I felt hollow, heavy, and desperate for quiet. The autumn wind in Tennessee had turned sharp, and the gray sky promised rain. I drove home slowly, telling myself that if I was careful, if I stayed quiet, maybe Jillian and Caleb would be asleep or out of the house. I practiced the words I always used when I felt their tempers brewing. You are right. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. Those sentences were armor-thin and dented, but necessary. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Jillian's car crookedly parked, her bumper nearly touching the mailbox, which always meant she was already angry. The porch light flickered above the door. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. She stood in the living room with her arms crossed, her face red and tight with fury, as if she had spent hours building her rage like a slow fire. Caleb slumped on the couch with a controller in his hand and an open beer on the coffee table, even though he was only 22. The moment the door shut behind me, Jillian launched into me. She wanted money, she said, because Caleb needed to pay off something important. She moved closer, practically spitting the words. Her voice shook the way it always did when she wanted me to understand that resisting her would only make things worse. I explained that I had just paid rent last week. I explained that my student loan payment had gone through this morning. I even explained that I had been buying groceries. But explanations did not matter to Jillian. They never had. She accused me of being selfish, accused me of thinking I was better than them because I worked at a hospital, accused me of hiding money so they would struggle. I stood there with my bag still over my shoulder and my badge still clipped to my shirt, trying to calm her down, but she cut me off with a hard slap across my cheek that made my ears ring. Caleb straightened on the couch, but not to intervene. His eyes narrowed with a kind of cruel satisfaction, as though he had been waiting for this moment. When I tried to back away, he shoved himself off the couch, took 3 steps toward me, and shoved me hard in the chest. I stumbled into the wall in the framed photo of my father that hung there tilted crookedly. Something snapped inside me when I saw that picture shift. My father's face behind cracked glass felt like a metaphor for everything I had been pretending was still intact. For the first time in years, I said no. My voice shook, but it came out louder than I expected. I told Caleb not to touch me again. I told Jillian that I was done being their punching bag. Jillian's eyes widened with surprise for half a second, and then her expression twisted with pure fury. She slapped me again harder, as if trying to erase the word no from the air. Caleb stepped closer. His jaw clenched. His breath smelled like beer. He muttered something about me running my mouth and then shoved me again harder this time, sending me crashing into the wall. The frame hit the floor, and the glass shattered. I stared at the broken pieces strewn across the carpet and felt something inside me splinter right along with them. Jillian moved toward me, yelling that this house was hers, and that I was lucky she let me stay. She called me an ungrateful burden. She called me dead weight. She raised her hand again, and when I tried to step back, Caleb came behind me and gave me a rough push that sent me sprawling onto my knees. Pain shot up my leg as Jillian kicked me in the side, not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to take my breath away. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth, the smell of mildew from the carpet, and the sound of Caleb laughing under his breath. It was the sound that finally broke me. I scrambled up my vision, blurring my ribs, aching, and I stumbled toward the front door. Jillian grabbed my arm, but I yanked free and sprinted outside into the cold air. The sky finally opened and rain poured down in sheets. I ran across the yard, slipping in the slick grass, half blinded by tears and water. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, climbed inside, and slammed the door. For a moment, I just sat there shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My cheek was swelling. My lip was bleeding. My ribs throbbed with every inhale. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Rain hammered against the windshield. The house behind me glowed warm and golden, as if it contained love instead of violence. I pressed my hands to the steering wheel and tried to steady myself, but the panic kept rising until I felt like I might choke on it. And then I remembered the wallet. My father's old leather wallet tucked deep inside my bag. My hands trembled as I reached for it. The leather was soft and worn, the edges frayed. Inside the inner pocket was the silver card he had given me when I was 17. I had not touched it in more than a decade. He had said to use it only when I had nowhere left to go. I stared at the card, my vision warping through tears, and for the first time since he died, I felt something like his presence wrap around me. I had spent years telling myself I was strong enough to survive that house on my own, strong enough to take every blow and every insult and still stand. But sitting there drenched in rain with bruises blooming across my body, I realized strength was not staying. Strength was leaving. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, put my car in gear, and pulled away from the house for what I knew, deep down, would be the last time. I drove toward the old stone bank at the edge of town because instinct pulled me there, because my father's voice echoed in the corners of my mind, because that silver card felt heavier than it ever had before. My ribs hurt with each breath, my cheek stung. My hands shook, but the tiniest spark of hope flickered beneath all the pain. I did not know what I would find when I walked into that bank. I only knew that everything in my life had reached a breaking point, and the next step would change everything. I walked into the bank lobby with my clothes still clinging to my skin from the rain and my ribs aching every time I breathed. But all I could think about was the silver card in my hand and the faint spark of hope it carried. The building smelled like polished wood and old paper. a scent that reminded me faintly of the nights my father used to come home late from the firehouse and drop his gear by the door. He always smelled like smoke sweat and something steady and dependable, and for a moment I felt that old ache in my chest again. The teller looked up from her screen, and her eyes widened just a little at the sight of my bruised cheek and swollen lip, but she didn't ask questions. She gave me a polite smile and asked how she could help. My voice shook as I told her I needed to check the balance on an old account. I slid the silver card across the counter. She took it carefully, almost puzzled as if she had not seen one like it in a long time. She turned it over once, then walked to a computer behind her station. A few seconds later, her expression changed. It wasn't dramatic, but there was a subtle shift, a tightening in her posture. She picked up a phone and whispered something into it before returning to me. She asked me to wait for a moment and then disappeared through a door behind the counter. My stomach twisted. I stood alone in the quiet lobby, feeling the weight of the card more than ever. Rainwater dripped from my hair onto the tile floor. A man in a gray suit sitting in one of the waiting chairs looked at me with mild concern, but I quickly looked away. My heart pounded in my ears. Maybe the card was frozen. Maybe it was invalid. Maybe my father had believed there was money in the account, but something had gone wrong after he died. After everything that had happened tonight, I was bracing for disappointment. 5 minutes passed, then 10. My pulse climbed with each second. Finally, a door opened and a tall, older man in a dark suit stepped out. He carried the card in his hand like it was something fragile. He introduced himself as Mr. Hughes, the branch manager, and asked if I could follow him to his office. My legs felt shaky as I walked behind him down a hallway lined with framed photographs of the bank as it had looked decades ago. His office was warm and elegant, all rich wood and soft lamp lighting. It reminded me of the living room in my childhood home back when my father was still alive before everything changed. Mr. Hughes asked if I would like water or a moment to compose myself. I told him I was fine, even though I was anything but. He sat behind his desk and placed the silver card gently on the polished surface between us. He asked for my ID, typed a few things into his computer, and studied the screen for a long moment. Then he turned the monitor toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. It was just a long string of numbers, but then the commas registered. My breath caught. The account balance displayed was $28,412,603 with additional decimal places behind it. My mind went blank. I stared at the screen, waiting for the number to rearrange itself into something more reasonable. I had always assumed my father had left me nothing because Jillian had taken over everything after his death. I assumed that if he had saved anything, it had gone into the house or the medical bills from his final months. But this number did not make sense. I whispered that there had to be a mistake. Mr. Hughes shook his head and pulled up another screen showing years of consistent deposits, investment growth, property income, and a series of notes signed by my father. My hands flew to my mouth as my vision blurred with tears. He explained that my father had opened the account when I was a toddler and had slowly grown it over the years. He had invested in healthcare companies and early tech stocks and in properties throughout greater Nashville that had since skyrocketed in value. Everything was placed under my name long before he remarried, long before Jillian entered our lives. My father had ensured that the account could only be accessed by me using the physical card he gave me at 17, the card Jillian never knew existed. I felt my throat tighten until breathing became difficult. Mr. Hughes said my father had left a note in the system for the moment I would finally come in. He clicked on the file and turned the monitor again. The message appeared in my father's handwriting, scanned into the file years ago. My daughter Avery is stronger than she realizes. If she is reading this, life has pushed her too far and she needs a way forward. This account is for her protection. Tell her I love her and I am proud of her. I pressed my hands to my face and sobbed quietly, the kind of tears that come not just from pain, but from relief and grief merging together. After years of being told I was worthless, after years of feeling alone, my father's words reached across time and wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I felt seen in a way I hadn't since he died. Mr. Hughes waited patiently until I could breathe normally again. He explained the full structure of the trust, the investment strategies my father had chosen, and the protections he had put in place to ensure that no one could exploit me financially. Every part of it reflected a level of planning and foresight I never realized he had. When my father was sick and dying, I thought he worried constantly about money. I thought he was struggling to keep us afloat. He never once hinted he had built something massive for me. He never bragged or complained. He simply worked in silence and hoped I would someday have the strength to leave if I needed to. I felt guilt twist inside me, the same guilt I had carried for years. I wondered how he could trust me with so much when I had spent so many years letting Jillian and Caleb treat me like I was nothing. But then another thought slipped in. Maybe he left me this because he knew exactly what I had endured. Maybe he saw what Jillian was becoming long before I did, and he wanted to protect me in the only way he could. Mr. Hughes asked if I wanted to transfer some funds into a new account for immediate use. The question felt surreal. Hours ago, I had been trapped in a violent house with bruises blossoming across my skin and nowhere to go. Now I had enough money to change every part of my life, enough to leave, enough to heal, enough to reclaim everything stolen from me. I nodded slowly and wiped my face. Yes, I needed somewhere safe to stay. I needed a lawyer. I needed to breathe without fear for the first time in years. As Mr. Hughes began entering the necessary information into the system, I stared again at the silver card on the desk. My father had handed it to me 13 years ago with eyes full of quiet warning and quiet love. I thought I understood the weight of it then. I had no idea. That card was the way out he built for me, the lifeline he left, and tonight, when everything else collapsed, it became the bridge between the life I was trapped in and the life I was finally strong enough to reach for. The first thing I felt when I stepped out of the bank that night was not triumph or relief, but a strange, disorienting mixture of power and fear, two emotions that rarely sit comfortably together. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the streetlights cast long reflections across the wet pavement as if the whole world had been washed clean while I was inside learning the truth about my father. I paused on the sidewalk, clutching the folder of temporary account documents Mr. Hughes had given me, and tried to breathe deeply without aggravating my bruised ribs. The pain was still sharp, but now it existed beside a new awareness, an understanding that I was no longer powerless. I walked to my car, feeling the same strange sensation I used to get as a child when my father would let me hold the flashlight while he worked on the engine. It was the feeling of suddenly being trusted with something big, something important. Except this time, the flashlight had become a financial legacy worth more than anything I could ever have imagined. I drove to a nearby hotel, a modest chain with warm lighting and quiet hallways, and booked a room without hesitating. It was the first time in years I had used my own money for shelter without worrying about how Jillian would react. I locked the door behind me, leaned against it, and felt my legs give out as the events of the evening hit me in waves. I sat on the carpet with the lights still off, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, and let the truth sink in. My father had not abandoned me. He had not chosen Jillian over me. He had been planning for this moment all along. That realization gave me enough strength to shower change into clean clothes from my bag and sit on the edge of the hotel bed with my phone in my hand. I knew what I needed to do next. I searched for the best family law attorneys in Tennessee, and one name kept appearing at the top of every list: Monica Graves. She had a reputation for being relentless, thorough, and unshakably loyal to her clients. I called her office expecting to be told I would need to wait days or weeks for an appointment, but when her assistant picked up and heard the tremble in my voice, she told me to come first thing in the morning. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jillian's face twisted with rage, or felt Caleb's shove against my back. My body still hurt, but now the emotional bruises throbbed even harder. The next morning, I arrived at Monica's sleek downtown office, the kind of place where the marble floors were so polished they almost reflected your thoughts back at you. Monica herself greeted me in the conference room. She was in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a calm, authoritative presence. She did not flinch at the sight of my bruises. She simply invited me to sit, brought me a glass of water, and told me to start from the beginning. I told her everything. The years of belittling comments, the financial manipulation, the forced contributions to the household, despite me being the only one who worked the escalating violence, the final attack that sent me fleeing into the night. When I described the card and my father's message, Monica's expression shifted from sympathy to strategic calculation. She asked to see the bank documents. When I placed them in front of her, she studied them with the intensity of someone who was already constructing a legal roadmap in her mind. She told me that the money alone did not change my legal standing, but the existence of the trust, the timing, and the fact that it was created before my father married Jillian changed everything. She explained that since the trust and investments were tied to my name long before Jillian entered the picture, none of it legally belonged to her. She also asked whether Jillian had taken control of my father's estate after his death. When I told her that Jillian claimed ownership of the house and most of his personal items, Monica asked whether I had ever seen a will. I told her Jillian insisted there was no will. Monica's eyes narrowed. She said something did not add up. Most men with terminal illnesses, especially firefighters who spent their lives planning for risk, created wills. Monica suspected Jillian might have concealed or destroyed legal documents. She immediately filed for a petition to investigate the property transfer following my father's death. Before I left her office, she placed a protective hand on my shoulder and told me she believed my father had been trying to safeguard me from the damage he sensed Jillian would cause. She said we would uncover the truth. After the meeting, I bought a new phone because mine would undoubtedly be flooded with messages from Jillian and Caleb. I checked my old phone and saw dozens of missed calls and voicemails already waiting. The early ones were furious rants demanding I return home immediately. Then came more desperate messages. Jillian's trembling voice said that she did not mean what she said, that she was overwhelmed that the house felt empty without me. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted again. She said she knew I was hiding money, that I thought I was better than them, that I would come crawling back once I realized how expensive life was on my own. Caleb's messages were worse. At first he mocked me, calling me weak for running away. Then he accused me of stealing from Jillian. Then his tone turned dark and he warned me that if I didn't come back to explain myself, he would come find me. I deleted the messages and blocked their numbers. It was not courage that made me do it. It was exhaustion. The thought of hearing their voices again, the thought of their hands on me made my stomach twist. I spent the afternoon touring apartments and chose a quiet one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building near the hospital. It had hardwood floors, a small balcony, and enough distance from the street to feel safe. I put the deposit down immediately. When I opened the door for the first time that evening, the silence wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I stood in the empty living room and breathed in the scent of fresh paint and possibility. For the first time in years, I felt space around me instead of walls closing in. I walked slowly through the small kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Every room felt like a promise. This was mine, not Jillian's, not Caleb's, mine. But even in that peaceful moment, a quiet dread lingered beneath the surface. It wasn't fear of the future anymore. It was fear of retaliation. I knew Jillian well enough to know she would not let me go quietly. She thrived on control. Losing me meant losing the stability she had drained from me for years. She needed someone to blame for her unhappiness, and I had been the most convenient target. And now that she realized I was no longer within her reach, she would look for other ways to tighten her grip. That evening, I ate takeout on the floor of my empty living room, using the temporary debit card from the bank to pay for my meal. As I finished eating, my phone buzzed with a notification from Monica. She had already obtained preliminary access to county property records and discovered something alarming. Several documents related to my father's estate had been signed by Jillian within days of his death. Multiple signatures did not match earlier versions of my father's handwriting. Monica believed Jillian might have forged his signature to transfer property rights to herself. When I read the message, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. My father had sensed this. He had known Jillian would try to cut me out. That was why he put everything of value into the trust. He had spent years building a safety net behind her back. He had been preparing for a battle I didn't even know I would have to fight. Now I had the resources to fight it, and I intended to. The legal war began faster than I expected, unfolding with a sharpness that reminded me of the first deep breath after stepping out of smoke during a hospital fire drill, that moment when the lungs feel shocked by clean air. Monica moved with relentless precision from the moment she confirmed that several documents connected to my father's estate showed signs of forged signatures. She told me that in Tennessee, forging a deceased person's signature to obtain property was not just unethical, but criminal, potentially carrying felony charges if proven. That knowledge left me stunned for hours. I sat in my new apartment on the floor, leaning back against the wall, while the evening sun filtered through the blinds and cast gentle stripes across the empty room. But all I could think about was the contrast between my father's steady protective love and the cold ruthlessness Jillian must have used to claim his home. That ruthless streak did not surprise me, but the scale of what she had done did. It meant that the violence she inflicted on me was just one piece of a much larger pattern. She had been erasing my father piece by piece the moment he died. The next morning, I met Monica again in her office, this time with her entire team present. They filled the room with legal pads, laptops, color-coded folders, and a kind of focused energy that made me feel like I was stepping into command headquarters before a major operation. Monica began outlining the steps we would take. First, her team would file a petition to reopen the probate process for my father's estate and review all documents executed after his death. Second, they would request an immediate restraining order against Jillian and Caleb, citing the violence and harassment. Third, they would initiate an independent handwriting analysis to verify whether the signatures were forged. And fourth, they would request a temporary injunction to freeze any assets Jillian had moved or sold in the last 4 years pending investigation. It was overwhelming. I sat quietly absorbing every detail, nodding even as my heart pounded. One part of me felt grateful for the movement, for the sense that something long buried was finally coming to light. The other part of me felt exposed. If Jillian learned we were reopening the estate investigation, she would explode. Monica noticed the tension in my face and told me that fear was normal, but this time I wasn't alone. She said something else too, something that stuck with me. She said that predators, no matter how confident they seem, always panic when the law knocks on their door. And she said she had seen enough cases like mine to know that Jillian would panic hard. By the time I left the office, the first filings were already being prepared. I went straight to work afterwards, still nursing bruises, but functioning better now that I had a safe place to return to. In the ICU that day, I moved quietly between beeping monitors and the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic, my hands automatic after years of routine. Yet beneath each action was the new pulse of confidence. I was no longer trembling. I was building something. That evening, after a long shift stabilizing a patient post-surgery, I returned to my new apartment and checked my phone. Monica had already emailed copies of the filings. She also warned me that Jillian and Caleb would receive notice soon. I felt the dread rise instantly, thick and heavy in my throat. 2 hours later, it arrived. My phone buzzed so violently it skidded slightly across the table. Jillian had left a dozen voicemails that grew progressively more erratic. At first, she tried pretending to be calm, asking where I was, insisting we could work things out if I just came home. When that didn't work, her tone darkened. She accused me of involving outsiders in family matters. She claimed I was trying to destroy her life. Then she screamed that I had no right to challenge anything about the house or my father's estate. Her voice cracked as she yelled that the house was hers because my father wanted it that way. The voicemail ended with her sobbing and saying she had sacrificed everything for me, a statement so absurd it would have made me laugh if it hadn't been so disturbing. Caleb's messages came next. They were shorter, meaner, and more volatile. He used phrases that made my pulse quicken and my stomach twist. He called me names I had heard him mutter under his breath for years. He demanded that I come home and stop the legal nonsense. He threatened to show up at my workplace. He said he would not let me ruin what was his. What was his? That phrase kept repeating in my mind long after I deleted the messages. It showed me exactly how Caleb saw my father's home, my father's belongings, and even my father's memory. He believed he was entitled to all of it, and Jillian had fed that entitlement every day since my father died. Sometimes I wondered whether she believed it too. Maybe she had repeated the lie so often that she convinced herself it was true. The restraining order filings went through quickly. Monica updated me that a hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, she encouraged me to begin documenting any contact from Jillian or Caleb. Every voicemail, every text, every attempted visit. She also advised me to consider therapy not because she thought I was unstable, but because she knew the trauma I carried would be triggered as the legal battle escalated. She said unresolved trauma weakened people in court, and she did not want me falling apart when the truth finally surfaced. I took her advice. I found a therapist named Dr. Harrison, a kind-faced woman in her early 50s with a soothing voice and a gentle firmness. She reminded me of the experienced nurses who trained me during my first year in the ICU. She listened as I described the years of emotional erosion, the subtle ways Jillian had made me feel unworthy, and the more violent episodes that had escalated during the last 2 years. She asked questions I had never asked myself. Why did I believe I needed to stay? Why did I think I had to earn love from people who offered none? Why did I keep telling myself that one day Jillian would change? Those questions pierced deep. For the first time, I realized how much guilt I had carried. Guilt for not being enough, guilt for not protecting my father's memory, better guilt for not leaving sooner. Therapy did not fix everything overnight, but it shifted something. It created space for anger and grief and self-compassion to coexist. It also made me realize that leaving that house was not an act of betrayal. Staying had been. Over the next few days, Monica's investigation unearthed even more alarming facts. Jillian had refinanced the house twice since my father's death, pulling equity out of it without any legal authority. She had taken out a large personal loan using my father's truck as collateral, even though she had no legal claim to the vehicle. Caleb had used my father's credit card for months after he died, charging hundreds of dollars in purchases. Monica prepared a detailed timeline showing every violation. When she showed it to me, I felt both sick and vindicated. Sick because every line on that paper proved how thoroughly Jillian had dismantled my father's life. Vindicated because it meant the law would finally see what I had lived with for years. Toward the end of the week, I left the hospital late one night and walked to my car under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. The air was cold and still. As I reached my car door, I froze. Across the lot, leaning against a flickering lamppost, stood Caleb. He was watching me. His posture was loose, too casual to be natural. When our eyes met, he smirked. I felt the blood drain from my face. My keys trembled in my hand. I forced myself to unlock the car and get inside. He did not move toward me, but he did not look away either. He stood there staring until I drove off. When I reached my apartment, I sat in the car for several minutes, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. Then I called Monica and told her what happened. She instructed me to file a police report immediately, which I did. Her team used the report to strengthen the restraining order request. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the hallway made my body tighten. Every passing car made me flinch. But beneath the fear was something sharper. Anger. Not blind rage, but controlled, focused anger. The kind that grows in someone who has finally been pushed too far. The next morning, I woke up with that anger still humming quietly inside me, and I knew that whatever came next, I would face it. Not as the version of myself that had spent years shrinking to fit inside Jillian's cruelty, but as the daughter my father had raised, the daughter he believed in. I wish I could say things got easier once the legal filings were submitted, but the truth is that everything tightened around me like a storm building without anyone noticing until the sky split open. The first sign came only a day after Caleb appeared in the hospital parking lot, watching me like a hunter waiting for the right moment to move. I woke early, took a hot shower to loosen the pain in my bruised ribs, and stepped into my kitchen to make coffee. My apartment was still mostly empty, just a couch I had bought off a local listing, a small dining table, and a bed frame waiting for the mattress to be delivered. The silence felt steadying. Then I saw it. My doormat had been moved, shifted slightly to the left. It was the kind of detail most people would miss, but growing up in a house where danger moved quietly, I learned early to pay attention to small changes. A chill crept up my spine. I crouched and lifted the mat. Something thin was tucked underneath. A photograph. A picture of my father and me taken on my 14th birthday at the Nashville Zoo. I remembered that day clearly because he had taken the picture right after I dropped my ice cream, and he bought me a second one even though Jillian complained it was wasteful. The photo had been ripped down the middle and taped back together hastily with the crease running straight through my face. My breath hitched. I stood abruptly and checked both locks 3 times. Someone had been at my door. Whether it was Jillian or Caleb, I did not know, but the message was clear. They wanted me to feel watched. I sent the photo to Monica, and she replied instantly telling me to file another police report and save the physical copy as evidence. She also reminded me not to be alone outside if possible. I did exactly what she said, but anxiety hung over me all day like a dark fog. When I arrived at the hospital for my shift, I glanced around the parking lot repeatedly. Everything felt too quiet. Inside the ICU, the noise of beeping machines and murmured reports from nurses should have drowned out my worries, but I felt my nerves buzzing underneath my skin. I moved through the shift steadily, caring for patients, adjusting ventilator settings, checking temperatures, but a part of my mind remained fixed on the sense that something was closing in on me. When I clocked out that evening, I asked a coworker named Jenna to walk with me to my car. She looked confused but agreed without asking questions. The lot seemed empty, but I could not shake the feeling that eyes were tracking us from somewhere unseen. I did not tell Jenna why I felt that way. Shame still clung to me even though I had no reason to feel embarrassed. Society teaches people to hide family violence to mask its bruises and its aftermath, and unlearning that instinct was harder than I expected. The following morning, more signs appeared. When I walked down the hall toward my apartment door after a grocery run, I saw something leaning against it. A shoebox. My heart thudded painfully. I put the grocery bags down, slowly approached the box, and nudged the lid open with the tip of my foot. Inside was a single item, the stuffed giraffe my father had won for me at a state fair when I was 8. Its left ear was torn off. I backed away instantly as nausea rolled through me. That toy had been in a trunk in Jillian's basement. I had not seen it in over a decade. My hands shook as I took photos and sent them to Monica, who told me to call the police immediately. I did. Officers arrived within minutes and asked whether I had security cameras. I told them I had just moved in and had not installed any yet. They suggested I do so as soon as possible. They took the box for fingerprint analysis, though one officer told me quietly that these cases rarely produced usable prints. Still, the report mattered. Every documented incident tightened the case for a permanent restraining order. I asked whether they thought Caleb was involved. They said they could not make assumptions, but the pattern was deliberate and escalating. That word, escalating, thudded inside my mind like a drumbeat. That was how these things often went. A shove became a slap. A slap became a punch. A punch became something worse. Now intimidation was shifting into stalking. And as difficult as it was to admit, part of me feared exactly where the escalation was leading. That afternoon, I installed 2 cameras myself, one facing my door and another facing the hallway. I also bought a third to mount outside overlooking the parking lot. I slept lightly that night, if it could even be called sleep. I jolted awake repeatedly at small sounds, convinced someone was at my door. At 3 a.m, I sat up in bed, shaking, and checked the hallway camera feed again and again. Nothing. But the feeling persisted. By the next day, the dread had settled into my bones. I forced myself to focus at work, even though exhaustion made my eyes ache. While taking a set of vitals, my phone buzzed in my pocket. On break, I checked it. It was a text from an unknown number. A photo. My apartment building taken from across the street at night. The timestamp was 2 hours earlier. My throat tightened. Another message appeared. You cannot hide from family. I backed against the wall of the break room, struggling to breathe. I felt suddenly small, like the same frightened girl who used to hide in her room while Jillian hurled insults at the back of my bedroom door. I forwarded the messages to Monica. She called immediately. She told me to save everything to block the number and to come to her office after my shift. She also said she was contacting the judge handling the restraining order to request an emergency hearing. My shift dragged on painfully each minute, feeling like an hour. When I finally left the hospital and drove to Monica's office, I felt raw and numb. Monica met me in the conference room with a look that was both reassuring and intense. She said what I was experiencing was the textbook pattern of an abuser losing control. She said that the moment I cut off communication and refused to return to the house, Jillian and Caleb were left without a target to dominate. They were scrambling, trying to force me back into the role they crafted for me. Stalking was an act of desperation. It was also criminal. Monica submitted the new evidence while I sat across from her clutching a tissue in my hand without realizing I had been tearing it apart. When she was finished, she said something that steadied me. She said the law was now firmly on my side. Judges take stalking seriously, especially when tied to prior violence inside a family. And this was no longer a simple family dispute. It was a safety case. That evening when I returned home, something new had been slipped under my door. An envelope. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. Inside were torn pieces of one of my childhood drawings taped together in the wrong order. The drawing showed a fire truck and my father standing next to it. The pieces had been rearranged so that his head was cut off. I felt something inside me break, not in the way I had broken under Jillian's insults for years. This was different. This was anger, real anger, protective anger, the kind that rises when someone desecrates something sacred. I took photos, bagged the evidence, and sent everything to Monica. Then I sat on my floor with my back against the couch and tried to slow my breathing. I thought about my father, his steady voice, his calm presence, his belief that I could survive anything. I realized in that moment that Jillian and Caleb were not just trying to scare me. They were trying to erase him the way they had tried to erase his memory in the house after he died. They wanted me broken and alone because a broken person is easier to control. But my father had not built that trust for a broken version of me. He built it for the woman he believed I could become. And now I had something they did not. Money, yes. Legal power, yes. But more importantly, I had clarity. I could finally see them for what they were. And they hated that. The next morning, the emergency hearing was granted. The legal war was no longer quiet. It was no longer indirect. It had escalated into open conflict, and standing in that courtroom soon would be the moment everything changed. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a cold sharpness that felt almost surgical, the kind of air that wakes every nerve in your body and forces you to stay aware. I dressed carefully in a simple navy blouse and black slacks, clothing that felt steady and respectful without drawing attention. My bruises had begun to soften into mottled shades of yellow and brown, but I still dabbed a bit of makeup over them, not to hide what Jillian and Caleb had done, but to prevent the courtroom from seeing me as fragile. I wanted them to see me as someone who was standing on her own 2 feet. Monica picked me up outside my apartment, and the moment I stepped into her car, she handed me a folder containing everything we had compiled so far. Police reports, photographs, timestamps, voicemails transcribed line by line. The shoebox incident, the ripped photo, the childhood drawing mutilated and taped back incorrectly, the text messages from the unknown number showing my apartment building in the dark. As I skimmed the documents, something tightened behind my ribs. Seeing everything assembled in one place made the pattern undeniable. For years, I had convinced myself that the violence and manipulation I experienced were isolated moments, sparks that eventually died out. But now, in front of me, the full story stretched across dozens of pages, each piece connecting to the next, until no part of me could deny that this had never been a temporary flare. It was an intentional system they built to break me. When we arrived at the courthouse, the building loomed tall and stern, its stone columns reminding me of the old firehouse where my father worked. Monica and I walked through the security checkpoint, and the guards nodded when they saw her, a sign of how often she practiced here. The hallway was cold and echoed with the sounds of heels shuffling papers and officers giving directions. When we reached the courtroom door, Monica paused and turned to me. She told me that whatever happened inside the truth was finally stepping into the light. She said I needed to trust the evidence and trust myself. I nodded, even though my heart thudded hard against my ribs. When we stepped inside, Jillian was already seated at the respondent's table, wearing a floral blouse and pearl earrings, pretending to be gentle and respectable. Her hair was perfect, her makeup soft and neutral, her expression composed. If someone had walked in without knowing anything, they might have mistaken her for a concerned mother attending a family dispute. But her eyes betrayed her. The moment she saw me, they sharpened, flickering with something dark. Caleb sat beside her in a wrinkled dress shirt that did little to hide the tension in his jaw. He looked restless, tapping one heel against the floor, shifting constantly in his chair. When his gaze landed on me, a small smirk curled at the corner of his mouth, as if he still believed he had the upper hand. The judge entered, and the room rose. Once we were seated again, the proceedings began. Monica presented first. Her voice was calm, steady, and razor precise. She laid out the timeline of violence and intimidation, walking the court through the evidence piece by piece. She began with the physical assault that forced me to flee the house. Then she detailed the stalking incidents, displaying the photo of my doormat being moved, the shoebox with the torn giraffe, and the rearranged childhood drawing. She played the voicemails Jillian had left, the ones where her tone spun wildly from pleading to threatening. She played Caleb's messages where he warned he would come find me. She submitted the text from the unknown number showing my apartment building at nighttime, stamped mere hours before I saw it. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize anything. She let the evidence speak for itself. I sat beside her, gripping the armrests as each piece was revealed. I could feel Jillian's anger growing beside me like a physical heat, and I could almost sense Caleb's stiffening with each audio clip that played. Then Monica shifted to the estate fraud. She presented the documents with my father's supposed signatures and compared them to verified samples from years earlier. Even from the bench, the differences were startling. She read aloud the timeline showing Jillian refinancing the house twice without proper authority, taking out loans against my father's truck, and allowing Caleb to use his credit card months after his death. The judge leaned forward, his expression tightening slightly, the first hint that he was no longer viewing this as a standard restraining order case. Jillian's attorney tried to object repeatedly, claiming the estate issues were irrelevant to the restraining order, but the judge allowed Monica to continue. He said the pattern of behavior was necessary for context, especially given the escalation of harassment. After nearly an hour, Monica rested her case. My breath felt thin. Then it was Jillian's turn. Her attorney stood and tried to paint me as unstable, suggesting that I had a history of exaggerated emotional reactions, that I had always been dramatic, that the photos and items left at my apartment could have been placed there by anyone. He insinuated that I was inventing threats to gain financial leverage. When he finished, Jillian stood and delivered a performance I had seen 100 times in different forms. She clasped her hands together and spoke in a trembling voice, claiming she loved me, that she had always treated me like her own, that she did not know why I would lie. She said I was confused and overwhelmed with grief over my father's death. She even suggested that I might be misremembering what happened during the last argument because of stress. She looked at the judge with wide, pleading eyes. I wanted to recoil. It felt like watching a stranger wearing Jillian's face. Caleb then stood and claimed he never hurt me, that I slipped when trying to walk past him. He denied ever leaving anything at my apartment. He said he never watched me in the parking lot. He insisted he had no reason to stalk me. His voice shook slightly, not from guilt, but from frustration. When he finished, Monica stood again. She asked permission for me to speak. My heart climbed into my throat, but I nodded when the judge asked if I wanted to testify. I approached the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, made the oath, and sat down. The room seemed to shrink around me. I told the court the truth, not dramatically, not with theatrics, but plainly. I described the insults that had worn me down for years. I described the violence. I described the fear of walking into the house never knowing which version of Jillian I would meet. I described the final attack, the shove from Caleb, the slap from Jillian, the kick to my stomach as I tried to stand. My voice shook, but never cracked. I spoke about running into the rain, bleeding, shaking, terrified. I described finding the photo and the shoebox and the drawing and the dread that came with every new sign that I had not escaped them. When I finished, the room fell silent. The judge looked at Jillian and Caleb for a long time before speaking. His voice was calm but firm. He said the evidence of intimidation was overwhelming. He said the violence described aligned with the injuries photographed at the hospital. He said the estate documents showed troubling signs of fraud. Then he granted the restraining order, 500 feet minimum. No contact in any form, no visits, no messages, no indirect communication. Violations would lead to arrest. Jillian gasped, her composed mask cracking at the edges. Caleb swore under his breath. Then the judge added something unexpected. He ordered a forensic review of the estate and referred the matter to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. Jillian's face drained of color. Caleb went rigid. A quiet wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. As we left, Jillian called after me, not loudly but with a choked, desperate tone. She said I was ruining the family. She said my father would be ashamed of me. I stopped walking. I turned just enough to look at her. I told her that my father would have been ashamed of the way she treated me. Then I walked out of the courtroom into the crisp afternoon air, feeling something I had not felt in years. Freedom. It was only the beginning, but the truth was finally on the record. And from this point forward, the law was watching them. The reversal did not happen overnight, but when it came, it arrived with the kind of quiet, unstoppable force that reminded me of watching a patient's vital signs suddenly stabilize after hours of chaos. It started with a phone call from Monica 3 days after the restraining order hearing. I was finishing a long shift in the ICU, scrubbing my hands at the sink, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, when she told me the forensic document examiner had rushed the results due to the court order. The signatures on the refinance documents, the vehicle title transfer, and 2 of the supposed property agreements were confirmed as forgeries. My knees almost buckled. It was the first official crack in the facade Jillian had built around my father's estate. Monica said she had already filed motions to freeze all accounts Jillian controlled and to prevent her from selling or transferring any assets traced back to my father. She also said the district attorney had opened an inquiry. I left the hospital that night in a daze, walking to my car under a wide Tennessee sky filled with heavy clouds. The air smelled like rain and asphalt, and for the first time in weeks, my fear was softened by something else: vindication. The next morning, news traveled fast. Jillian's bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. Caleb's debit card, which was tied to one of Jillian's accounts, declined at a grocery store, prompting him to cause a scene that ended with a call to the police. The officer on duty noted the restraining order in the system and warned him that any attempt to confront me would lead to immediate arrest. Meanwhile, Monica continued digging. She discovered that Jillian had been funneling money out of my father's accounts for years. Small amounts at first, then larger sums, until she had stolen over $1 million through fraudulent transfers, unauthorized loans, and forged paperwork. The evidence piled up quickly, each piece slotting into place like a puzzle, revealing the shape of someone's greed. And the shape was Jillian. By the end of the week, the court issued a temporary ruling that froze all disputed assets and appointed a neutral third party to oversee the estate review. Jillian was barred from accessing the house she had claimed for years. When she tried to argue that she still lived there, the court ordered her to vacate immediately until the investigation was complete. The deputy who delivered the notice found her screaming at the front door, insisting she was being framed. But the law does not bend to theatrics. She was removed. I did not witness it in person, but Monica described it to me with careful professionalism, saying only that the eviction was peaceful but emotional. Still, just imagining Jillian being escorted out of the home she had stolen from my father filled me with a sense of justice I had never felt before. It was not joy, and it was not spite. It was something deeper, like watching a storm cloud finally break after years of darkness. Caleb did not handle the unraveling well. According to police logs Monica later obtained, he was pulled over 2 nights later for driving erratically. He failed the sobriety test but begged the officer not to arrest him because he was stressed about family stuff. When the officer ran his name and saw the restraining order with its violation warnings, Caleb froze. He was cited and released, but the incident was added to the record. The pressure was mounting on all sides. At the same time, the local news picked up the story. A small Nashville station known for covering community legal cases released a short segment titled "Questions Raised in Dalton Estate." Investigation. My father's name was mentioned along with vague references to fraudulent property transfers. My name was not mentioned, but Jillian's was. Footage showed the house I grew up in with a reporter standing outside explaining the situation. I watched the clip from my couch with a strange mix of grief and grim satisfaction. Grief because my father's memory was now entangled in a news story. Satisfaction because the truth was finally being spoken out loud. The public pressure grew quickly. Neighbors who once admired Jillian for her polished manners and quiet smile began whispering. Old acquaintances of my father reached out to the station with stories contradicting Jillian's claims. One former coworker of his said he remembered my father talking about leaving the house to me. Another said my father had mentioned creating a trust for me before his health worsened. Meanwhile, Jillian appeared on her porch the next morning when reporters arrived wearing oversized sunglasses and insisting she was innocent, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. But the cracks in her composure showed. She repeated herself too often. She contradicted herself. She appeared irritated and frantic. The station aired the clip that same evening. It did not help her case. 2 days later, the judge issued a new order. The house my father had owned, the one Jillian had claimed as hers for 4 years, was officially placed under the control of the court-appointed estate manager until the final review. Jillian was not allowed to enter. Caleb was explicitly barred from coming within 1,000 feet of the property due to the police report detailing his parking lot behavior toward me. I should have felt victorious, but what I felt was heavier and more complicated. A part of me grieved the years I had spent trying to survive under their control. Another part of me felt guilty for taking back what should have been mine all along, even though none of this was my doing. Trauma twists the mind in strange ways. It teaches you to shrink even when you have finally grown. That same afternoon, something happened that solidified the reversal more clearly than anything else. Jillian called Monica's office crying. Not angry crying, but terrified crying. She begged to speak with me. She said she could explain everything. She said the house meant the world to her. She said she did not know how she would survive without it. Monica calmly replied that I would not be taking her call. When Monica told me this, I sat in silence for a long time. A year earlier, maybe even a month earlier, I might have felt compelled to comfort Jillian out of habit, to reassure her, to shrink again, to soften. But now, the numbness I felt was its own kind of clarity. That night, I drove past my childhood home. I stayed in my car across the street, watching as a locksmith changed the deadbolts under the supervision of the estate manager. The porch light glowed softly. The windows were dark. For a moment, I imagined my father standing in the doorway again, laughing gently as he told me to bring in the groceries before the ice cream melted. My throat tightened. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe through the ache in my chest. The reversal was happening. They were losing everything they stole. And for the first time, I did not feel guilty. I felt aligned with the truth. Over the next few days, the investigation accelerated. The forensic report expanded to include more documents, some of which showed alterations so blatant the examiner described them as almost careless. Jillian had grown bold over the years, relying on the belief that no one would challenge her. Now, every bold act was being peeled back and documented. The district attorney's office requested interviews. Officers visited Jillian's temporary residence. Caleb received notice of potential charges related to unauthorized use of my father's credit card. Jillian's lawyer withdrew from the case, citing an irreconcilable breakdown between attorney and client. Word spread through the community that the Daltons were under investigation, and people who once turned away from my pain now turned their attention toward the truth. I thought back to the girl I had been at 17 when my father gave me the silver card. I carried it in my wallet through college, through nursing school, through long shifts in the ICU, never once realizing the weight it carried. Never knowing it was the rope my father had left tied above the well he knew they would drop me into. And now I was climbing out of it foot by foot, leaving Jillian and Caleb at the bottom where they had tried to keep me. When Monica called me again with an update, her voice was warm. She said this was the strongest reversal she had seen in years. She said the truth had finally gathered enough weight to crush the lies that held me hostage for so long. And as I sat in my apartment, the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, I understood something. Justice was not always a dramatic moment. Sometimes it was a slow, steady reclaiming of what should never have been taken. And this reversal was only the beginning. The weeks that followed the reversal moved with a strange rhythm, a slow blending of recovery and recalibration that felt as fragile as the first steps a patient takes after weeks in a hospital bed. Each day in my new apartment grew a little quieter, a little safer, and a little more mine. I decorated slowly, letting the space breathe, while I figured out what healing actually meant for someone who had spent years living in fear. Some mornings I woke before sunrise curled on my couch with a blanket draped around my shoulders, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and letting the stillness touch me in places I did not know were wounded. Other mornings I woke with a jolt, the echo of a raised voice lingering in my memory, even though the apartment around me stood peaceful and untouched. Healing was not a straight line. It came in uneven waves, rising and receding without warning, but each day the undertow felt a little less powerful. Returning to work helped too. The hospital had always been a place of focus and purpose for me, and walking into the ICU each morning reminded me that I was capable of grounding myself even when everything else in my life felt uncertain. One evening after a long shift, I walked into the break room for a quick cup of tea, needing something warm to settle the tension in my chest, and found Evan sitting alone with a stack of patient charts. He looked up with that steady calm he always carried, a quiet gentleness that never demanded anything but offered more than most people realized. He asked how I was holding up. I hesitated, then told him the truth. Not everything, not yet, but enough that he understood the weight hanging over me. He nodded without pressing for details and poured me a cup of his own tea blend, something with chamomile and mint that smelled like a soft place to land. We sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind that exists between two people who do not need to fill every second with words. Over the next few days, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes he found me restocking supplies and made a quiet joke to ease my nerves. Sometimes we walked to our cars at the same time, talking in short bursts about small things like weekend plans or favorite coffee shops. He never asked personal questions unless I offered something first, and even then his responses were thoughtful and warm rather than probing. It felt strange to be seen without feeling examined. One evening after work, he asked if I had eaten dinner. When I said I had not, he invited me to join him at a quiet diner a few blocks from the hospital. I almost declined out of instinct, but something inside me loosened just enough to say yes. The diner was simple and cozy with soft yellow lights and the faint scent of grilled onions in the air. We sat in a booth near the window, and for the first time in a long time, I ate a meal without feeling rushed or tense. Evan asked about my favorite parts of nursing, about the moments that made the job feel worthwhile. I told him about the time I helped comfort a patient who woke from surgery terrified and alone, how I held her hand until she calmed down. He listened with a softness that made my throat tighten. When he offered to walk me to my car afterward, I let him. The night air was cool, carrying the smell of rain, even though the sky remained clear. When we reached my car, he paused and asked if I felt safe getting home. His tone was steady, not pitying, not invasive. I nodded, and he smiled in that quiet way he did, the corners of his eyes warming. That was the beginning. Not a grand romantic moment, not a spark that lit up the sky, but something smaller and more healing. A gentle presence, a steady companion, someone who made the world feel a little less sharp. Over the next weeks, therapy with Dr. Harrison helped me understand the deeper wounds I carried. I learned how years of belittling comments had rewired parts of me to anticipate rejection. I learned how to breathe through panic instead of being ruled by it. I learned that my father's love had been the foundation of my strength, even in his absence. During one session, Dr. Harrison asked me to describe what safety felt like. I said I was not sure I had ever felt it. She asked me to pay attention to moments where my body felt less guarded rather than fully relaxed. And when she said that, I realized something surprising. I felt that way around Evan, not completely unburdened, not magically healed, but steady, present, less alone. One evening after another long shift, I returned to my apartment and found a small bag hanging on my door. My heart lurched at first, but then I noticed the handwriting on the attached note. It was neat and simple. "You mentioned your migraines the other day. Thought this might help." Inside the bag were 2 herbal teas and a reusable cold pack. No dramatic declarations, no intrusive questions, Just kindness. I stood in the hallway holding the bag for several minutes, unsure how to process the warmth spreading through my chest. It had been so long since anyone offered care without demanding something in return. The next day, I thanked him, and the smile he gave me was soft and almost shy. Our conversations grew longer after that. Sometimes we talked during breaks about our favorite childhood books or the patients who shaped our careers. Sometimes we shared quiet moments after difficult shifts, letting ourselves exist in silence without forcing anything else. He never touched me without asking, never leaned too close, never made assumptions about what I wanted. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in me began to settle. One night, after a particularly grueling shift involving a code blue that left the whole team shaken, I walked into the staff lounge and found Evan waiting with 2 sodas from the vending machine. He handed me one without a word. My hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the code, and without thinking, I sat beside him. He did not try to comfort me physically. He simply sat close enough that I could feel the steadiness of his presence. After a few minutes, I spoke. I told him I had spent years living in a house where fear felt normal. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions that were too sharp. He just listened, nodding occasionally, allowing me to speak in pieces rather than demanding a full story. When I finished, my throat was tight and my hands still shook slightly. He looked at me gently and said, "You deserved better than that." It was such a simple sentence, but something inside me cracked open. I did not cry, not this time, but the weight I carried felt a little lighter. He walked me to my car again, and when we reached it, he hesitated. He asked softly if he could give me a hug. I nodded. It was brief, warm, careful. The kind of hug that asked nothing and offered everything. For the first time in months, my body relaxed into someone else's arms without flinching. When we pulled apart, he stepped back respectfully. He told me to drive safely. I told him good night. In the days that followed, our connection grew the way flowers bloom in early spring, slowly and quietly without forcing themselves into sunlight before they are ready. He never rushed me. I never felt cornered. We simply allowed the moments to unfold, and somehow that gentle pacing felt like the most profound part of my healing. Because for the first time in my adult life, I was building a relationship not out of fear, not out of obligation, not out of survival, but out of choice. And the more I chose these moments, the more I realized how much I had changed. I was not the woman Jillian and Caleb tried to break. I was not the frightened daughter hiding in the corners of a stolen house. I was becoming someone stronger, steadier, more willing to believe in tenderness again. And as I watched that new version of myself emerge piece by piece, I knew something with quiet certainty. This was the beginning of a life my father had hoped I would find. A life where love came gently and safety grew slowly. A life where healing was allowed to take its time. The final stretch of the legal battle arrived with a heaviness that felt almost physical, as if the air itself thickened every time Monica called with another update. By then, the investigation had matured into something undeniable, a detailed map of every lie, forgery, and theft Jillian had committed since the day my father died. But the weight of the truth did not dull the sting of hearing it laid out piece by piece. It hurt to know how thoroughly my father's wishes had been ignored and how easily I had been pushed aside by people who claimed to be family. Yet beneath the hurt was something steadier, something that felt like the spine I had grown slowly over the last months. I was no longer the woman who trembled at every raised voice. I was someone walking toward justice with her shoulders squared. The final hearing was scheduled for a cool Tuesday morning, and I arrived early dressed in a simple charcoal blazer and black flats, choosing clothing that grounded me without feeling like armor. Monica met me on the courthouse steps, her expression resolute. She carried 2 massive folders filled with documents, reports, statements, and forensic analyses. She warned me that Jillian might try one last performance, and she told me not to look at her for too long. Not to give her the satisfaction of seeing whether her presence still rattled me. I nodded, not because I needed the reminder, but because I appreciated the care in her words. When we entered the courtroom, Jillian was already seated at the respondent's table. She looked thinner than before, her shoulders hunched, her hair hastily pinned up her usual polished appearance, replaced by something brittle and anxious. Caleb sat beside her, biting the inside of his cheek, his knee bouncing uncontrollably. When he glanced at me, the smirk he once weaponized so easily had vanished. What replaced it was a flicker of panic. The judge entered, and after the room rose and settled, the clerk began reading the list of matters on the docket, including the petition to finalize the estate investigation, the fraud findings, the criminal recommendations, and the request to transfer all assets legally belonging to my father back to me. Hearing my name spoken aloud in legal context made something tighten behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, but the gravity of how far this case had come. Monica presented first. She spoke with controlled fire, her voice firm, her cadence steady. She walked the judge through the forensic handwriting report that confirmed multiple forged signatures. She presented the bank statements showing unauthorized transfers into Jillian's personal accounts. She presented loan documents Jillian had acquired using my father's truck as collateral despite having no legal claim to it. She presented a timeline showing how Jillian refinanced the house twice in 4 years, extracting equity she had no right to. Then she shifted to the restraining order violations, the stalking incidents, the voicemails, the photographs, the text messages, the taunting items left at my apartment. She did not embellish. She did not dramatize. She simply laid the truth bare. It hit the courtroom like a wave, steady and undeniable. When she finished, the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening with each passing second. Then Jillian's attorney rose, clearing his throat nervously, and tried to argue that Jillian had acted out of grief, that she had been confused by paperwork, that any signatures she provided were accidental rather than malicious. But even he did not sound convinced. Jillian stood next. She attempted her familiar performance, her voice trembling as she insisted she had always loved me, that she never meant to hurt me, that everything she did was to protect the family. She claimed my father verbally told her she could manage the house after his death. She said she assumed I did not want the responsibility. But the more she spoke, the more tangled her explanations became. She contradicted her previous statements. She twisted details abruptly. Her composure cracked under pressure, and at one point she even glanced toward Caleb as if begging him to confirm one of her claims. He looked away. When it was his turn, Caleb insisted he knew nothing about the forged documents, but his voice shook when Monica asked him to explain why he used my father's credit card months after his death. He tried to blame Jillian. Jillian tried to blame him. For the first time, the two of them were not united. Their alliance fractured the moment the consequences became real. When the judge finally asked if I wanted to make a statement, I rose slowly. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept them clasped in front of me and spoke with honesty rather than anger. I told him about growing up in the house my father built with his own hands. I told him about the steady love my father gave me, the stability he worked so hard to protect. I told him how everything changed after he married Jillian, how she began isolating me, belittling me, turning the home into a place of fear. I told him about the night they hit me and the years of small cruelties that led up to it. I told him about discovering the trust my father built in secret and how it revealed the truth of what he really wanted for me. When I finished, the room was silent. The judge looked at me for a long moment before nodding and asking everyone to be seated. He began reading his ruling slowly and deliberately, each sentence shaping the outcome of the last 4 years of my life. He found that Jillian had knowingly engaged in financial fraud. He found that the house and all associated property belonged to my father's estate and therefore legally reverted to me. He found that Jillian had stolen significant funds through unauthorized transfers, and he ordered her to repay the amount with interest. He upheld the restraining order and extended it to a permanent protective order. He recommended that the district attorney pursue criminal charges for forgery fraud and identity misuse. Then he addressed Caleb. He found him guilty of unauthorized card use and issued a suspended sentence with mandatory community service alcohol counseling and probation. If he violated any term, he would face jail time. Jillian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Caleb slumped back in his chair, his face pale. The judge's voice remained calm as he continued, but each word carried the weight of finality. He stated that my father's true wishes were clear, that the trust he built for me showed deliberate intent, and that the court would honor that intent fully. When he finished, he stood and left the bench, and the room rose again, rustling with quiet murmurs. Jillian turned toward me with a desperate look, tears streaking down her face. She took a small step as if to approach, but the bailiff immediately blocked her path. She reached out anyway, pleading with me, saying she had nowhere to go, that everything she had was gone. I looked at her for only a moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. I told her softly that everything she lost had never belonged to her. Then I walked out of the courtroom with Monica by my side, feeling a strange stillness settle over me. Justice was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was steady and honest and overdue. Outside, the air smelled like early spring, cool and clean. Reporters waited near the steps, but Monica guided me past them, shielding me from the swarm of questions. When we reached the parking lot, she placed a hand on my arm and told me she was proud of me. Proud of how I stood. Proud of how I survived. I thanked her, though the words felt too small for the gratitude inside me. As I drove home, sunlight filtered through the windshield in soft beams. I rolled the window down slightly, letting the breeze brush my face. Somewhere in the middle of that drive, a quiet realization settled over me. I was free, truly free. Not because Jillian and Caleb had been punished, not because I had regained everything my father left for me, but because I had reclaimed myself, my life, my voice, my future. And that, more than anything else, was the justice my father always wanted for me. The weeks following the final hearing passed in a way that felt both surreal and deeply grounding, as if my life was stitching itself back together one quiet morning at a time. With Jillian and Caleb legally out of my orbit, the constant tension I had grown so accustomed to dissolved into a stillness that felt almost foreign. I would wake up in my apartment and take a moment just to breathe, letting the sun filtering through the blinds remind me that fear was no longer the first emotion that defined my day. It took time to trust that safety was not temporary, that peace was not an illusion waiting to be shattered by a slammed door or raised voice. When I received the finalized documents transferring full ownership of my father's house to me, I drove there alone before even telling Evan or Monica. The house stood exactly as it always had in my memory, with its weathered porch railing and the stubborn rose bush my father planted the year I turned 12. Walking up the steps felt like stepping into a version of myself I had lost somewhere along the years of surviving Jillian's cruelty. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old wood and something warm, the way childhood homes always seem to hold memories in the air. I ran my fingers along the door frames, the kitchen counter, the old banister my father sanded and stained by hand. For a moment, I felt overwhelmed by everything the house represented, not in terms of money or ownership, but in terms of belonging. My father built this home for us, not for the people who had tried to erase me. Standing in the living room where he once helped me practice school presentations, I whispered a quiet, "Thank you." It felt like speaking to him across time. Over the next few weeks, I began making slow, deliberate changes. I hired a local contractor to repair the roof and refinish the hardwood floors. I painted the walls soft shades of cream and sage colors that made the rooms feel like they were breathing again. I tore out the heavy curtains Jillian had installed and replaced them with light fabric that let the sunlight pour into every corner. Each change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I moved into the house at the start of summer. Evan helped me carry boxes and set up furniture, never once questioning my choices or suggesting alternatives. He simply followed my lead, asking where I wanted things checking in to make sure I was not overwhelmed. Some nights we sat together on the back porch sipping tea and listening to the cicadas as the sky faded into deep blue. I could feel the difference in the air between us, the kind of calm intimacy that comes not from intensity but from trust. He never rushed me. He never pushed me to define what we were. He just showed up steady and gentle, earning my trust by existing without cruelty. One evening, he stepped into the nursery I had created in one of the spare bedrooms, a space filled only with soft blankets, a small bookshelf, and the rocking chair my father once used. He rested his hand on the back of the chair and looked at me as if seeing something sacred. "You made a home here," he said quietly. "A real one." I knew what he meant. A home is not walls or furniture. It is a place where you do not flinch at every sound, a place where you can exhale without fear. For the first time in my adult life, I had that. I returned to the ICU after a brief leave, and my coworkers immediately noticed the change in me. I moved through the halls with a steadier rhythm, my voice calmer during chaotic moments, my mind clearer. Even my patients seemed to feel it, as if calm radiates in ways we do not fully understand. My supervisor pulled me aside at the end of one shift and told me there would be an opening for a charge nurse position soon and that she wanted me to consider applying. I laughed, partly out of disbelief and partly out of joy. A year earlier, I could not have imagined anything beyond survival. Now, here I was being asked to lead. One Friday afternoon, Evan invited me for a walk in the backyard where the grass had grown soft under the late summer sun. As we reached the rosebush, still blooming stubbornly, the same way it had in my childhood, he paused. His expression shifted into something both nervous and certain, a rare combination on a man who usually moved with surgical precision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it slowly. Inside was a simple gold ring, elegant and understated, something that felt like me, rather than anything flashy. "Avery," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I have loved you in every moment since the day you let me sit with you in the hospital cafeteria. I have loved you when you were unsure and when you were brave and when you rebuilt yourself from the pieces someone else tried to break. I want to spend my life with you not to complete you, but to stand beside you as you continue becoming everything you were meant to be. Will you marry me?" I stared at him, this man who had entered my life not as rescue, but as reassurance, who had never treated my trauma as an obligation, who saw me as whole long before I ever felt whole myself. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." When he slipped the ring onto my finger, the wind rustled through the rose leaves, and for a moment, it felt like the world acknowledged the moment with us. We married in a small ceremony in the backyard a few months later, just close friends and colleagues. No drama, no spectacle, no ghosts from the past. Only peace. Only beginnings. Life settled into something soft and stable after that. The protective order held firm. Jillian and Caleb faded from the news and from my mind. Their actions had consequences, and they were living with them. I did not check the court records. I did not follow their stories. Their downfall no longer fed my healing because healing had moved beyond them. I focused on my work, my marriage, and my home. A year after the final hearing, I stood in the doorway of what had once been a place of fear and was now entirely mine and entirely safe. I thought about the girl I had been at 29, covered in bruises and rain, clutching a silver card like a last lifeline. I thought about the woman I had become standing tall in the house my father left me, the house I reclaimed from the people who tried to destroy me. They beat me, thinking I would stay weak forever. They did not know my father left me a future strong enough to save me, and now I live that future every single day. If this story resonates with you, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what part of Avery's journey speaks to you. And tell me this, what would you have done? Before you go, I want to talk to you directly because if you stayed through Avery's entire journey, then something in her pain or her strength or her comeback stirred something inside you. Maybe you know what it feels like to be dismissed by the people who should have protected you. Maybe you have survived cruelty behind closed doors that no one else ever saw. Maybe you spent years shrinking yourself so someone else could feel big. Or maybe you are watching this from a quiet room with the lights low and thinking about a version of yourself you had to bury just to make it through the day. If any of that feels familiar, then let me tell you this. Your story is not over just because someone tried to break you. Sometimes the people who tried the hardest to crush your spirit end up becoming nothing more than a footnote in the life you build without them. If you have ever been told you were worthless or too much or not enough, I want you to write in the comments where you are watching from and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the night Avery ran through the rain with nothing but a purse? Was it the moment she learned her father protected her even after he was gone? Was it when the court finally believed her? Or was it when she realized she deserved love that did not hurt? Your voice matters here. You matter here. If you have ever escaped a toxic family or found peace after years of chaos, I want you to share your story, even if it is just a single sentence. Someone else scrolling right now may need to see that survival is possible. And if you are still in a painful chapter, still fighting quiet battles that no one sees, Let this be your reminder that you do not have to stay small to keep someone else comfortable. You do not owe loyalty to people who choose to harm you. You owe loyalty to the version of yourself who still hopes for something better. Drop a comment and tell me what part of your life you are rebuilding right now: a job, a home, a family, a sense of self. And if you want more stories about women and men who refuse to stay broken, hit the like button so this video reaches someone who needs it, and make sure you subscribe, because every week I share stories about resilience, justice, unexpected twists, and the quiet kind of strength that grows when the world underestimates you. This is your space to breathe, your space to feel, and your space to speak. Now, tell me this. What would you have done in Avery's place?